May the force be with you, young professionals. There is no better way to spend Star Wars Day than talking about electric cars. So thank you for joining. A few words about YPE. YPE is a nonprofit with 40,000 members across 40 chapters, dedicated to providing opportunities to networking and knowledge sharing for young professionals in energy. I'm Janika Stein, Bay Area Chapter VP of Partnerships, and I'm also a product manager at Enel e-mobility, working on EV smart charging algorithms. If you have job openings in your companies, please post them in the chat. You can also post questions to the participants, and they will be answered at the end of the panel. After the panel, we will have a happy hour in breakout rooms, and you're welcome to stay if you can. And with that, let me pass the mic to Andrew.
Cool, thanks, Jenya. And thanks YPE for hosting this event. I'm super excited to be a part of the discussion. I think this is a really interesting and salient topic to be talking about now. Before I kick it off, maybe a quick intro on myself. My name is Andrew Cornelia. I'm currently the Chief of Staff to the CEO at Volta Charging, as well as the Head of Corporate Development. I also currently serve as the Commissioner at the Sustainability Commission for the City of Sausalito, and prior to Volta, I was at Tesla for a few years. So I think, I've been following this space for a while, and as I said, I think this is an interesting time to talk about this larger transition to electric mobility. Personally, I believe this transition will be one of the largest macroeconomic shifts of our lifetime. I think it will impact not only how we get from point A to point B, but also how we think about the larger energy grid system, how we think about generation, how we think about storage, how we think about transmission. It'll impact how government shapes policy. It'll impact how government serves its constituents. It will change the way traffic flows. It'll change how cities are designed, how infrastructure is built. And fundamentally, I think it'll also change the behaviors you and I take for routine. So needless to say, this is a large and far-reaching impact, which speaks to, I think, our diverse set of panelists on the phone today, who I will have introduce themselves here in 1 minute. But first, my previous statement, at some point in the next 20 to 30 years, a significant portion of the cars on the road today, when we look outside, will be electric. But I think if you look outside today, the reality on the street is that we're not there yet. IEA says that by 2030, the EV stock will be about 7 to 12% of all cars on the road, where today we're less than 1%. So this discussion is really meant to talk about that transition, how we go from 7 to 12% to plus 50%, how EV mobility transitions from sort of an early adopter technology to mass market, and how we think about the accelerants and the possible impediments to mass electric mobility. But before we jump in here, I think it would be wise to have the panelists introduce themselves and maybe give a quick intro on how each one of them covers the respective EV industry. So Quin, maybe we'll start with you here.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Quin Garcia. I'm one of the managing directors of Autotech Ventures. We're a venture capital firm based in Menlo Park, now remote, all working from home, that invests in ground transportation startups, so movement of people and goods along the surface of the earth, to include energy efficiency, transport energy efficiency, electrification. We're investors in Volta Charging. We've invested into Lyft, invested into Truck Labs, formerly known as Extreme Trucking, which was a trucking fuel efficiency startup, and a bunch of others. And I'm just super passionate about EVs. I've been started working on hybrids in 2003 as the head of the Cornell hybrid electric vehicle team, and then was part of the founding team at Better Place back in 2007, doing electric car recharging infrastructure. I'm an observer on Volta's board, so been an EV driver, love this stuff.
Awesome, thanks Quin. David, how about we pivot to you?
Sure thing. Hi, I'm David Schlosberg. I'm with Enel e-mobility. I came to the electric vehicle space first while I was at Google in the 2014 through 2016 timeframe. was toying around with some things there with Google's charging on campus, which at the time was probably the highest concentration of EV charging in any one place, especially on campus. And then 2016, I joined a young startup called Electric Motorworks Inc., or sometimes called eMotorworks, and went on the wild ride of a pre-A startup, and was lucky enough to be one of the few clean tech companies that gets a good exit. So we were acquired by Enel Group in 2017 and became part of Enel's distributed, customer-sided energy solutions group called Enel-X. So I've been there ever since.
Great. Smriti, how about you?
Hi, gonna call me Smriti, it's easier without the R. So I'm Smriti, I'm at WeaveGrid, and I've been at WeaveGrid for roughly the past year. We have a software that helps utilities better integrate electric vehicles so that drivers have just the fluid charging experiences that they were promised at low cost. And it's been really exciting for me to think through, like, the complexity of both bulk and local system challenges that utilities are facing as charging really picks up. And like you were just describing, Andrew, going from that like low percentage to the plus 50%. And, grid planning happens on long horizons in order to keep the lights on all the time. And so it's been great to like be a part of having EVs be, on that journey. WeaveGrid works with some of the largest utilities in the country already, including Exelon. So it's been great. And before WeaveGrid, I was at National Grid. So I've been on the utility side thinking about very similar problems. I was a director of distributed energy there. So thinking about the whole array, and EVs are certainly a unique asset class. So this is a good place to jump in.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Okay. Last but not least, Jamie.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Jamie Hall. I'm on the Energy and Environment Policy team for GM. I spend pretty much all my time working on policies and programs to grow the EV market faster. So that's working with utilities on infrastructure build out and electricity rates and vehicle grid integration, working with regulators on standards and incentives, and just sort of all the things we can do to speed this up and get all the benefits that we all want to see. I've been at GM for 5.5 years, working on EVs that whole time. And before GM, I worked on sort of the clean transportation policy space with an organization called CalSTART that has an office here in the Bay Area, works with companies across the clean transportation space to do demonstrations and run programs for state agencies. And I was their policy director, doing a lot in the medium and heavy duty electrification space back then. So came out all this from policy, sort of environmental and energy policy side of things. And policy is an important driver for the EV market. So it's fun stuff.
Great. Okay. So, I mean, there's a million ways to jump in here, but I figured we'd start with a big question, which is to say, we're less than 1% of the car stock today. I think everyone on this call has some sort of belief that EVs will be a large portion of the car stock over time. That transition is very much happening today. What are the largest impediments that we're still facing? Across policy, across investment horizons, across technology. I think, starting broad here, what are those impediments? Maybe Jamie, back to you.
I mean, this may sound overly simple, but I think we just have to get to the point where this is a no-brainer decision. And so it's got to just be better in every way, and then people will rapidly make the jump. So we need more vehicles in more classes at lower price points so that we can have an EV that works for everyone's lifestyle. And we need to improve the charging situation. And so that means more fast chargers. And I know we can get into this later, but people need to be confident that they can do everything in an EV that they're doing in a conventional vehicle today. And the whole value proposition needs to make sense. And these are fundamentally better vehicles in many ways, but we've got a little work to do still to get to the point where everyone sees this and has no reservations, feels like they're not having to sacrifice anything. And I mean, we've all seen what can happen when a technology comes along that's just better. It absolutely takes off, and there are just still some things we need to do overcome barriers around the sort of utility of this technology and explain it to people.
So I think you mentioned a few things there, and maybe we'll use one of those to jump into some detail. And you mentioned charging, and David, you mentioned your sort of kind of nascency in the market, looking at Google workplace charging. How does charging play either an impediment or an accelerant to the larger EV transition, and how is Enel X thinking about charging?
Sure. I mean, the adoption rate certainly has skewed towards those with means, but also those who can support home charging, right? Because that no-brainer, they don't have to think about it. If you can come home and plug in at your home, it's better than the the ICE experience, right? You don't have to go to in the freezing cold to the gas station, and you don't have to breathe in those fumes. You don't have to drive your kids up there and you're worried about all the people who are around you. You didn't have to go there during COVID. It was amazing, right? And so eMotorworks and Enel X, we grew up in the residential EV charging space. And so we were approaching that market. As we get into the heart of the adoption curve, we're going to find more and more people who find I would say, who actually know that this is a thing, right? I think Jamie's right on everything he said, but there's also like people thinking like, oh my gosh, yeah, you can get an electric car. I think that there's a lot of people out there, the education is lacking that that's a thing. And right now it's literally, social proof. Someone in my network has one of these and tells me how it is, and then they realize they can go get it. And it's helping that GM and others are marketing, much more so these days, but they need to know it's a thing. But for those people who are not going to be easily able to install a fueling station in their home, they are going to need access. And that access could either be at work or in the public sphere. And, obviously utilities are working very hard to support private access and public charging, both in the workplace and the public space. But, even as someone who tried to drive to wine country in the Bay Area with a 90-mile range EV, it's hard to figure out how to do it, right? And I'm someone who should know how to be able to find a fast charger. So it's still lacking, and we'll need to improve so that we can get to the situation that Jamie talks about, where people don't have to have a second guess about where they're going to get a charge.
So I think you mentioned public charging. I mean, home charging, I think the stat I've heard is that, a third of the population will not have access to home charging. Permitting code, multiple unit dwelling homes, as price points come down, people in more of the urban area will need to rely on that public charging. I mean, Quin, how do you look at public charging as sort of a piece of the equation to solve some of these impediments to a larger EV adoption rate?
Yeah. So public charging for if we're talking about passenger vehicles and light vehicles. So my take is that the longer range becomes, the less important opportunity charging becomes. People will charge at home for the most part, and maybe at the office when we get to return to the office for the most part. And they'll need to make fewer kind of pit stops along the way, with exception to long road trips where folks are gonna have to stop, halfway between, let's say, Bay Area and LA or Tahoe or otherwise. So I would say that EV charging infrastructure actually should become over time a little bit less important in terms of public infrastructure. In terms of private infrastructure, yeah, I mean, more and more people are going to have charging stations in their home, and everyone has a wall outlet, and more people are kind of upgrading to the 6.6 kilowatts or higher.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, is that to say that the battery, if we're talking about sort of range capacity, and even looking at Lucid as an example, I think they're coming out to market with one of the larger battery sizes around 500 miles of range on a single charge. Is that the sort of trend line that you're seeing, sort of in the market, where battery sizes are getting larger and larger? Do you think more OEMs and manufacturers are going to push in that direction?
It feels to me like the sweet spot for passenger vehicle batteries. I mean, if we talk about long haul trucks, different story, but sweet spot for passenger vehicle range for EVs, in the 200 to 400 mile range. And I think you start to kind of hit this asymptote of diminishing returns once you get beyond it. Obviously it varies, it depends on climate and, are we in a place that's really cold and thus needs heating, or really hot and thus needs a lot of HVAC or air conditioning. It depends on vehicle form factor. Are we talking about a pickup truck that's towing, expected to tow and carry heavy loads and thus needs more energy on board? Or are we talking about a taxi, which needs to be able to continuously drive throughout the day, although a lot of taxis rarely go over, say, 200, 300 miles of range. So once you get beyond that, there's really limited benefit in, let's call it, more energy dense batteries, right? So I think we're kind of moving down we're continuously improving the quality of today's or the performance of today's lithium-ion batteries. We're improving in terms of gravimetric density, volumetric density, cost, energy density, and the like. And I think we're getting closer to the point where it's not going to be as big of a constraint as it has been basically forever.
So I think the magic number is what, $100 per kilowatt hour? Is that sort of where we hit price parity with internal combustion engines? So when we think about costs, and Jamie, you had talked about this before in terms of one of the impediments to larger EV adoption, how is GM thinking about battery size compared to general cost? I think I saw a really interesting article recently that said, over the last 8 years, EV prices have actually been increasing versus decreasing on average per vehicle brought to market.
Yeah, it depends on what these vehicles are. And I think you're also seeing larger, more capable vehicles, so that plays in there. But certainly to really reach the mass market, we've got to give people the range that they want at a price that makes sense. And so the battery is the key here. And battery prices have come down dramatically in recent years. But a lot of that cost reduction is being plowed back into larger batteries to give people more range and bigger vehicles. So these things cancel each other out to some extent. We're still on, I think, the trend is still exciting, watching these battery prices come down, and we're going to get more and more affordable vehicles. On the Bolt EV, which is GM's existing vehicle now that has, 259 mile range, we just cut the price on the model year 22 version by several $1,000s. So this is a good thing. But on the other hand, people want bigger vehicles. They want to be able to tow, and they want to go far. So we've got to keep pushing on both. And the parity question, when do we reach cost parity, is complicated, because what does that mean? What are you comparing? And really overall, it's got to be sort of parity in terms of the total value that the vehicle is providing. And there are things EVs can do that conventional vehicles can't do. And right now, I'd say vice versa as well, because the fueling experience is so easy with a conventional vehicle. So that question we could spend all night on. What is parity and when do we get there?
Yeah, and I think the economics, and whether it's sticker price or total cost of ownership, it is a discussion worth having. Quickly though, before we move on from the battery section here, Smriti, your world very much touches sort of the alternative use case for how we use these batteries. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that and how WeaveGrid thinks about EV batteries and increasing size of EV batteries and their applications beyond maybe just moving the car forward.
Yeah, so this is something that's really interesting. I think that driver behavior or car adoption is going to change a lot when people understand that your driving life means having a full tank of gas every morning, right? And whether that's because you're able to charge at home and leave every day with that full tank, as opposed to going to work and charging there. I think it's going to be a part of people's routines. That's something that's growing. Another trend that we're seeing that will make that a lot easier is, we're increasingly hearing about automakers that are selling their cars with a charger. And so the question of what am I going to do at home is all kind of resolved at point of sale, and so that it can be easy for consumers to think about what this is going to be like in their life. And like you said, of course, understanding what just plugging into your outlet at home can look like. And that is something that I think is really cool about what WeaveGrid does, is that, we give the folks who are, just plugging into their wall outlets the same access to utility programs. But then there's a whole range for then, as battery sizes are increasing, right? So you've got one element of adding to grid strains on that end versus the like slow charging of just plugging in at home, which is, you know, a lower grid constraint, right? And what's actually the most interesting isn't what type of technology does each car have, it's the diversity of solutions that are going to be on the road and plugging in. And for utilities, you know, they have very little sight and information to how is, you know, this behavior evolving, what's happening in our territory, what kinds of, you know, batteries and technologies are different people using. And so that's a pretty hairy problem to solve, because utilities are used to being able to, you know, have full information about all of the energy assets in the space. And I think there's a lot about EV adoption and grid integration that is going to actually mirror a lot of what's happened in solar in the past, right? Just like we were saying, like people, you know, got solar because a house down the street got it and you heard about it from a neighbor. So we're seeing that similar clustered approach to EVs. It addresses range anxiety when you know someone who's a driver, and, you know, hear about that experience better. Yeah, but I think it's going to be really interesting because the large batteries add an element of diversity from an integration standpoint that can increase, you know, grid issues. And so, yeah, there's going to be a much more, you know, robust set of technology solutions that are going to be kind of like Jamie was saying, right? Like we need to do all of the things better.
Andrew,
go ahead. Yeah, David.
Yeah, following that. So I forgot to say that we're kind of in similar space in Enel as WeaveGrid and providing vehicle grid integration solutions. So that's what Jenya, who's listed as YPE SF Bay Area host, and I do. And everything that Smriti says is correct. One thing, we only orient around level 2 right now, and a vast majority of, not vast majority, but more than half of EV owners right now charge level 1. So we really don't see them in our world. However, when you see larger batteries, you see more people opt for level 2, and those batteries get bigger. Also, the charging power that those cars can do is getting bigger. So before, only Tesla and like a Mercedes and a really old Toyota RAV4 charged more than 7.2 kilowatts, right? Now, pretty much every new, you know, EV model that's kind of like an SUV is coming out with higher power capabilities, right? So, and then at the same time, when people have, even at L2, have larger batteries, they charge less on average than they did before. So even before, people might only plug in every 2.5 days on average. You think people do it every night, but just as across a portfolio, they don't. And so when people move to a bigger battery, they also change their charging behaviors. So it becomes a little bit harder for those utilities to figure out when those are going to go on, if they really need to micro-target the load management. But now that more people will get level 2 chargers and higher power capacity, they have more dwell time. So they plug in and they plug out. They don't need all that time to charge. Whereas before with their level 1 charger, they did. So it creates more flexibility for the utilities to work with companies like WeaveGrid, companies like Enel to put that charging where it's most efficient for the grid.
Maybe a follow-up question on this, and for Smriti and David and whoever else wants to jump in, is, you know, I kind of think of utilities as the new OPEC, right? I mean, they're going to be providing the energy for, you know, the future mobility. So, I mean, if there is available power in these batteries, isn't that competition for the utilities? Where do utilities play in the value chain for electric mobility? I mean, is this something that they're controlling? How do they fit in here?
Yeah, that goes down the rabbit hole of just utility business models, right? And so even when you think about, like, are they competing? I mean, we can talk about, is V2G a thing? Is bi-directional charging going to be a thing? I actually think that's probably my most controversial opinion. I'll just put out there. I think V2G is one of our, if not red herrings, like longest term before, you know, as we're talking about range anxiety, it's going to be a long time before drivers are comfortable with you tapping into their battery in a bi-directional way. And home backup might be the pathway to it for different areas. But that's just kind of adds to the complexity of how the utilities relationship to their customers is changing, right? There's a way that people, you know, love their cars and rely on their cars that they've never thought about a utility being a part of that relationship. And the way you think about turning your lights on is very, very different. And so utilities have a lot to evolve on for how those customer relationships will look and feel. I don't think that there are elements of it generally that are, feeling competitive, in part because in most parts of this country, I guess I don't quite know, this is really maybe a Jamie question, or like which areas of the country utilities are allowed to own generation, right? So like, for example, when I was at National Grid, if I can wear that hat for a second, National Grid actually did own generation, managed transmission, distribution, and grid like operations, but did it all in different regions, right? We weren't allowed to kind of maintain all of those things in the same zone. Like there's a limit to monopoly powers. In that way, there are some regions that do allow for that full integration and have more limited though territories, right? Have like a lot of smaller territories. And so there's that interaction where you need more resources and stuff. And so I think that's an interesting piece of how utility business models are evolving. And generally EVs are seen as an opportunity to, there's utilities are very interested in improving their customer experiences and are interested in that engaged customer. And so this is an opportunity to go down that pathway. It's an opportunity for them to, potentially have more load. And then to the extent that, we think about controls, I think that's going to be something that evolves. Like how does control live in the land of incentives and education, right? And customer understanding. And where does control need to live from a safety standpoint, often in as literal electrical controls that like sometimes need to be shut off or enabled in different ways. So yeah, it's a lot of things happening down that rabbit hole.
I mean, I don't know if Jamie can comment on this, but there's a theory that the automakers messed up by giving the oil business to the oil companies, right? Same way that they've messed up giving the radio business to media. And like there's this really valuable asset people sit in all the time and have to do a lot of commerce in, but like the automakers, got in one piece of it, right? And so I think I think that the utilities are somewhat hamstrung depending on the regulatory environment to be the fueling provider in a way that makes profits. I mean, they just need to have a better relationship with their customers. And I think if you consider that an EV could consume half of your electric life, the automakers might just want to jump in front of that whole relationship at that point, right? In Europe, you definitely see, BMW might want to be your electric provider in deregulated markets in Europe, right? And so, now you're bringing the car and electricity supply, and well, now who's OPEC in that scenario? I mean, it's not OPEC, but who's the fueling provider?
Completely.
And for what it's worth, so we see the utilities as incredibly important to this whole thing, and it varies. Big utilities, small. Are the regulated investor-owned utilities? Or are you talking about municipal utilities that can maybe move a bit more quickly? But this transportation electrification is the best thing that's come along for the utilities forever. They've got declining load. There's all this efficiency. And along comes significant load growth that is smart and flexible. This is potentially a really, really good thing for them. I think what role they end up playing versus everyone else does remain to be seen. But for the near term, they're essential partners for getting infrastructure deployed. Their interconnection processes can, make a big difference in the speed of that rollout. Electricity rates that they set can either put up big barriers or create opportunities for more infrastructure and for vehicle grid integration. And they're a really important player here that can help move things along quickly. But it'll be interesting to see what this whole sector looks like in 10 years.
Yeah, but I think that you're both make a really good point. Like not only is the utility relationship to customers changing, but automaker relationships to their drivers are also potentially evolving, right? And you're seeing a lot more automakers recognize that and think about, like working with, electric providers in a different way that they've, ever thought about in the past, right? And taking that relationship from being something that is, really just based on point of sale and then maintenance, right? You come in for your car's maintenance and ongoing like kind of parts and services into something that kind of affects daily life. And, it's an opportunity for automakers to evolve their customer relationships as well. And actually we love kind of sitting in that partnership and helping both sides.
And I think that's actually a great segue. I'm curious to kind of talk a little bit about the OEMs and sort of, some of the legacy automakers versus some of the more EV first automakers. So, I mean, Smriti, even to that sort of point on experience on the driver side, Jamie, how is GM thinking about this transition to electric mobility and sort of competing with some of those EV first companies?
I mean, I think the industry overall sees that we're moving to an all electric future, and it's just a question of how do you time this and how do you do it right. But our CEO is really all in on this, and we've committed $27 billion to electric and autonomous technologies in the near term. We're bringing 30 additional vehicles to market. So we think, first and foremost, as an automaker, we need to make more and better vehicles and improve the customer experience. I think this is what the EV-only companies are doing as well. It's just, we're doing multiple things at one time. But if you look across the industry, everyone is figuring out what are the vehicles that customers want and how do we solve all of those, thorny issues like charging infrastructure. Interesting, I think, announcement recently that sort of shows different ways of coming at this. You have Rivian building out a closed network of chargers, and I think it'll be interesting to see what other automakers do. The approach that we've taken is we need to grow this market overall. It would be difficult if we had closed networks for every single manufacturer. This is a strange future to envision, and so we've been working to build out infrastructure that's open to everyone on a common standard. But I don't know. It's going to be an interesting couple of years.
Well, I commend you guys for the sort of Ultium network that you guys announced. I mean, I think that open standard seamless charging experience is a really important one. Walled gardens are not the approach as we try to get ready for EV acceleration adoption here. Quinn, maybe a question for you on. Go ahead, Jamie.
Well, quickly, the goal with that is just to stitch together the network that exists today. The other piece of this is that we've partnered with EVgo to put in another 2,700 DC fast chargers around the country in and around metropolitan areas. And this can be particularly useful for people like me that live in an apartment building. I've seen a lot of chat about this in the chat on Zoom. There are a lot of people who do not have a garage and don't have an easy way to charge at home. And if we can get more of these urban and suburban fast charge clusters out there, you make this a realistic possibility for more people.
Completely. I think while we're on the sort of technology conversation, I'm interested, Quinn, to kind of hear your perspective on this. I mean, you look at a lot of startups, what are the sort of new technologies or new trend lines in the EV space as either peripheral technology or core technology where, some of these larger players like GM or Tesla should be adopting? What are you seeing out there that's interesting that you think will be part of the landscape going forward?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to kind of bucket the categories of startups that we see. One is by, let's say, function. So energy transfer, EV charging infrastructure is an example of energy transfer. Energy storage, we've been talking about batteries. Energy conversion, so motors, inverters, electric heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. And then, after, let's say, the kind of life cycle of the vehicle, once vehicles age, you're going to have to repair them, and you're going to require some infrastructure in order to service them and training of mechanics and other folks. There's an opportunity to reuse some of the components on the vehicle, whether it be the battery or let's say copper windings or other. There's an opportunity to ultimately recycle. So that's one way to bucket it. Another way to bucket it is by vehicle type. So, starting from small to large, micromobility. So it's game over for combustion and micromobility already. Everything's electric or pedal powered. There's there used to be some gas scooters running around in various parts of the world, but like if you look in, micromobility in China, it's all gone electric. India is still trying to transition away from their combustion scooters and tuk-tuks over to electric now. So that's kind of at the small end. And then if you get above passenger vehicles that we've been talking about, you start to get into vans. So vocational vehicles like work trucks and last mile delivery vans. And then you can get into short haul trucks. I'm personally of the opinion that long haul trucks are not going to be electrified anytime soon, just because it's, you know, the amount of energy that needs to be stored on board is just massive. But I do think that there's an opportunity for drayage and other kind of short haul point to point, let's say 100 miles from distribution center to distribution center.
So Smriti had used the term red herring, and not to sort of correlate these two things, but I mean, what are people's thoughts? People talk a lot about V2G. I hear a lot about AV, autonomous vehicles. How do those two concepts or technologies play into the larger transition? Is AV the future of all mobility, or is that just a buzzword right now? Should we pay attention to that?
If maybe I could jump in, I think autonomous is really interesting because it could help us answer this question of like what's going to make people get excited about EVs, and I think that there are, you know, potentially more people excited about autonomous as safety features and convenience and all of that. And all electric vehicles need not be autonomous, but all autonomous vehicles will be electric. And so I think that as AV grows, like you're naturally going to have the EVs growing as well. And so it's a really interesting part where the people who, you know, don't care about their carbon footprint or other elements that might make, you know, the current consumer thinking about an electric vehicle, autonomous just opens up a whole new kind of customer preference, right, and customer persona. So I think that'll be a cool trend for EV growth.
Jamie, how is GM thinking about some of these sort of future technologies versus building the Lyriq as a, you know, mass market car? What's the balance there?
Future technologies as in vehicle grid integration and autonomous and things like that?
Correct.
So GM believes that all autonomous vehicles should be electric, and that's where we are. That's not actually a consensus position across industry, but I mean, I live in San Francisco. I imagine this is a Bay Area event, so some of you probably do as well. And I see a mix of vehicles autonomous vehicles on the road today. It includes the Cruise AVs, which are built on the Chevrolet Bolt EV platform, but it includes some others, some plug-in hybrids and some internal combustion engine vehicles. So we'll see where industry ultimately goes there, but we see a lot of synergies between automation and electrification, and think these things really, for a number of reasons, should go together. We're also very focused on, you know, vehicle grid integration and all the things we can do to, including, you know, in looking ahead into the future, maybe you can use your vehicle for backup power when there's a power outage or whatever it is. These are all exciting things that EVs can do that conventional vehicles really can't, that help improve the overall value proposition and make this a more exciting thing for people. So there's a lot we can do with one-way power flow in the near term. Definitely a lot of lower hanging fruit there, and I don't want to jump ahead to V2G with two-way power flow as the only opportunity for vehicle grid integration, but we're looking across the board while we, you know, put out more of these vehicles. And the other thing that we're doing as far as future technologies and automation is really advanced driver assist programs, what we call Super Cruise, which is in the Cadillac Lyriq and the new Chevrolet Bolt EUV that's coming out later this year. And I've tried it. It is a really impressive system.
I hope it's better than those videos of seeing the AV sort of engineering sort of mocks of people in a Tesla and it's shaking all over the place. So I have faith that we'll get there, but I'm not getting behind the wheel anytime soon. Maybe switching gears here for a second, because I do want to cover some of the policy topics. And I think, you know, for anyone who plugged into the presidential debates, I think that was the first time I've ever heard a politician talk about EV charging. And, you know, Biden has spoken a lot about EV charging, a lot about infrastructure, a lot about electric mobility. Kind of a big question here, but I'm curious to hear people's opinions on, you know, what is the role of government? Biden has talked about, you know, 500,000 EVs. A lot of our governors here in California and Massachusetts throughout the country are putting out 2030, 2035 goals for mandates around EV sales. What is the sort of correct level of engagement by the government, and where have we seen successes in the past, whether it was with solar or other sort of nascent technologies? Kind of open question to the group there.
Well, I mean, Jamie's doing this daily. Quinn probably thinks about it a lot. Smithy's thought about it over time. I mean, I used to do policy for eMotorworks as well. The vehicle tax credit has certainly been powerful, and to the extent that it gets extended for the automakers who have already tripped over the 200,000 vehicle sales, that will be critical. I'm sure there'll be a bit of a debate over, high-end drivers, high-end owners versus, the more middle class, if you will. There's some interesting proposals from, I forget the congresswoman in California, but basically, if you have a battery that's made in America, that vehicle tax credit is much higher than if it's a different type of battery. There are other things that the government has done. The government has EV infrastructure tax credits as well. They're pretty hard to monetize. I mean, you think about big solar projects or rooftop solar projects that are bundled into, project financing vehicles to utilize those tax credits and sell those tax credits to banks. There's not really a well-functioning market yet to monetize tax credits, and they top out pretty quickly if you're going to do a large installation of like DC fast chargers. So I think that if we really wanted to use those sorts of incentives to help supercharge, not to use a Tesla term, infrastructure, they could be improved. The Biden administration's also talked about 500,000 public chargers, but I haven't studied it. Maybe Jamie has, but it's a big question to me. Does that mean the government's just gonna drop, 100% of that money into those fast chargers? Or are they going to do refundable tax credits, or, a cash grant, if you will? Or, what is it going to be that is? And, I think private industry would suggest, how can that money be leveraged, right? If the government's going to do more than just say we want 500,000, but there's going to be money on the table through, the Biden jobs plan or the infrastructure plan, how does that manifest into, private capital really helping to accelerate that deployment?
So I'm happy to
see maybe, jumping in here.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, if we want to move things along faster, for three really simple buckets, we think government can be effective on the infrastructure side, for sure. There's not a lot of detail yet around what those 500,000 chargers are, how much of that is level 2 versus DC fast, where are they, and what are the mechanisms to get these chargers out there. But it's definitely 500,000 additional chargers would be sort of a good down payment on where we need to go, and the details will matter. Part of what the federal government can also do on infrastructure is just pull together best practices and help state and local governments, who are really important in this as well, not have to reinvent the wheel and learn from best practices and lessons learned in areas that have already tried this, already done charger deployment programs, already figured out, how to speed up permitting and things like that. That's the first bucket, is infrastructure. Then vehicle incentives, incredibly important. Both GM and Tesla have hit that tax credit cap. I mean, this is just a simple, undeniable fact that money on the hood is going to help move these cars more quickly and help the industry scale up. And then the final category of things, at the federal level anyway, we are losing out in many ways in from a global perspective here to other countries that are doing more to support this market. And so we're really hopeful that there can be more investment in R&D and domestic supply chains and minerals. There's a lot that needs to happen here if we want the U.S. to lead in electrification. And that's been, forever a well-accepted role of government, is to help on R&D and sort of domestic production issues.
I kind of think of three buckets when I think about who's funding electrification. One would be government, one would be private companies, and the other would be large public companies. private companies like startups and the VCs who invest in those startups tend to be more capital light, and they also tend to have higher risk and higher potential return, right? And thus they attract, investors who are seeking that kind of exposure. Public companies are very good at asset intensive, capital heavy business models, and they tend to attract investors who are seeking lower risk and lower return. Governments vary from nation to nation. If you look at Singaporeans, maybe they behave a little bit more like capitalists, and whereas our government tends to allow our financial markets to address many types of projects that are enticing to investors, and then our government tends to fund projects or companies or initiatives that maybe the private markets haven't been willing to touch, and maybe these projects tend to make a little bit less money, but they also tend to have some more social good and the ability to win votes. I would say corporations, if I had to say whose cash right now is making huge impact, I don't actually think VCs are very impactful in electrification nowadays. I think it was different some years ago, but if you look into propulsion systems and batteries and infrastructure and whatnot, these are big capital intensive projects, and so a lot of VCs I think are it's not as great of a fit for many VCs. You start to get into big corporations who are great at capital intensive, and of course governments are really good at capital intensive as well.
Yeah, 500,000 chargers will cost a pretty penny. So good thing that the government is carrying that check. I think I'm just an eye on the clock here. We're getting close to the end, so I do want to leave some time for Q&A, but maybe just sort of a fun exercise before we wrap up to Q&A is a quick lightning round here. And I'm curious to know, of our panelists, who has an EV today? If you do, what are you driving? And, what was the biggest sort of good or bad surprise from transitioning from gas to electric? And if you don't, why not? And then we'll all shame you if you don't have one. So get ready for that. So maybe Quin, starting with you.
I don't have an EV, but I don't have any car. I'm carless. So my last car was an EV, but then I decided in 2016 to try living carless, to ride my bike more and do kind of intermodal transit, so scooters and rideshare and the like. And I noticed my life was better not owning a car, and so I've been doing that ever since.
Clearly don't have kids.
Just had one a month ago.
So what are you getting your EV, your SUV?
We have a stroller, human powered. It's healthy.
Get an e-stroller. We got to get those on the market.
Yeah. How about you, David?
I worked at eMotorworks for 1 year before I got an EV, and I was shamed on every corporate presentation, like all of us were who didn't have. My first EV was a Chevy Bolt, because I was not on the Model 3 waitlist, and I wanted to have a long-range EV, so I never had to stress about getting a charge ever. I also had free chargers at work and at home, so that was helpful. But my lease ran out, and I now drive a Honda Clarity, only 90 miles of range on a good day. And so, like I said, I've had a few, when I pulled into my house tonight, I had 8 miles left, which was never something I experienced with my Bolt. But my biggest surprise was that my Bolt had less auto cruise features than our 2015 Subaru Forester. So I'm really happy to hear that that the EUV is going to have some awesome Super Cruise. Yeah, I mean, not having to go to a gas station for like months at a time is pretty darn amazing.
Completely. Jamie, how about you?
I also do not have an EV, and it's also because I primarily don't really need to drive. I live in San Francisco. I don't have a garage. I've never, and this makes me unusual for a GM employee, I've never actually bought a car. So I'm still hopeful that when I do buy my first car, it will be electric. But that will require me, I think, to live somewhere else, because not only am I in a multi-unit dwelling, I don't have a garage at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm on the top floor, and I see a lot of people around here running the extension cord out the window, and that would not even be, first of all, I don't think that's the safest move ever. Second of all, not feasible from where I am. David, you're the first person I've ever spoken to that's got the BEV version of the Clarity. I don't know how many of those have been sold, but that's good to know.
There were a fair number sold. There was a 17 and 18, and there was a 17, 18, 19 at least. I did not buy my Clarity. Just I earned one, and Jenya is having one show up at her apartment today or tomorrow too. So a free EV is better than any EV I know. So
completely. Smithy, last but not least.
Yeah, well, I deserve the shame. So I don't have an electric vehicle, and I bought a car in like 2018, and it wasn't electric. So we very strongly considered buying electric, but ultimately didn't, actually, because we didn't see a good SUV model and needed a high clearance vehicle because my family does a lot of camping. So like we do a lot of camping. We have been on back roads where we have been worried about our low clearance cars, and so like we actually really need a high clearance vehicle to do that for the weekends that we do. But we're definitely going to be all battery electric for our next car, and we'll replace this one when we can. So it's still relatively new, but at some point we would definitely want to make the swap, and have already, despite not having an electric car, are making plans to add charging space to our garage. So we're making charging plans on the front end anyways. But I think that Quin and Jamie get to like just one other, I think, really interesting element that we didn't talk about, but urban planning is often geared towards discouraging people to own cars in cities. City planners don't want city dwellers to own cars. And often when you want to buy a car, there's a lot that the city kind of does to encourage you to move to the suburbs. And I think that there are good reasons to like have that too. Like we don't need to kind of live in our car culture that has been really big in America, and there are a lot of areas where you don't have to have a vehicle. And so there's another interesting element as we think about electrifying transportation. Our true north is lower carbon impact, and you can do that without the car in the first place.
100%.
I do end up riding in cars a lot. So, being in the city, you get in Lyft and Uber a lot. And so this could be another whole discussion, but electrifying those transportation network company fleets, really exciting opportunity, really high mileage. And that's where a lot of the urban miles are going to come from.
Yeah. And I feel like we've only touched on like really the sort of peak of, a lot of mountains here related to EV and this transition. So I know Rena and Jenya are going to be sending out a link after this to people in terms of, what are the topics that individuals want to hear about going forward. I think, urban planning and the future of mobility would be a great one. I think other forms of electrification, whether it be heavy duty or, sort of scooters and bikes and pedal power, to use Quin's words, would be a really interesting one, or I guess going away from pedal power. But I think let's wrap it up here because I do want to leave time for one or two questions if we have them. But before we do that, I want to thank our panel for contributing and joining, and it's been super informative. So thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, also for moderating, and you've done a great job of organizing us. You and Danielle.
This reminds me of the first YPE event that I attended in 2007. Still going strong.
Wow.
It was virtual too?
You're an OG, no. Quin. Yeah. Cool. Okay, let's take one or two questions if we have them. I know there were some in the feed, but those look to have been answered. If they weren't, we can answer them live here. Shoot for our panelists or open discussion. Crickets.
Andrew, I think you should just call people at random and have them think of a question. Or we solved everything.
Okay. No questions. Clear.
I got one for you guys.
Great.
Yeah. My name's Ed. I live in Camas, Washington, just east of Vancouver, Washington. I own an EV car. I own a Chevy Volt. And in my town, there's no charging stations. And I own a commercial property in town. It's a standalone retail site. It's a bike shop. It used to be a bank. So I have a unique situation where I have power to where the ATM goes because the ATM is still a client of ours, tenant of ours. And so I want to run EV stations on my parking lot. But the idea I came up with while doing this is I'm also a commercial real estate broker. And I had an interesting thought about using people such as in my trade as being ground troopers for finding sites appropriate for EV stations. We're at commercial sites and locations continuously. So I just wanted to throw that out there for anybody who's looking for ways to identify locations besides ones along the freeway that the government wants to, install. Things that can work in little cities to help bring other people to that small town to patronize the town, help other residents own EV cars as well.
And thanks for that call out. Appreciate that. I do think that we're going to need charging in all sorts of areas. Where you go is where you will charge in the future. It's definitely not going to be built on the old infrastructure model. Maybe a couple questions here in the thread just to answer one or two, and then I think we need to wrap. Steve asks, a couple of you mentioned that all AVs will likely be electric, but not all EVs will be AVs. Why do we anticipate no ICE AVs?
I think Jamie was saying that not all AVs will be electric. That there are some autonomous vehicle companies that they don't care if it's electric or internal combustion, or they might actually be internal combustion.
I expect some ICE AVs. So long haul trucks would be an example. Mining vehicles, those huge mining trucks, maybe even some construction machinery.
Yeah, part of the reason that I've heard about the trend of having a lot of the light duty autonomous vehicles, I think you're certainly right about there being very different developments for medium and heavy duty vehicles, but for light duty vehicles, I think the software development that happens for EVs and autonomous can often be efficient to create the software controls in the same way, and so it's because there's underlying software in both areas that autonomous and electric often go hand in hand. But Jamie, I'd actually love to hear from you, because I actually don't know as much about like how different automakers are thinking about that for their light duty vehicles and what the trade-offs are really considered.
Yeah, and I can't speak for others, but I know that there's been a lot of talk in the policy world around, should we just mandate? Should California somehow mandate that all AVs must be electric? And that idea has not been welcomed with open arms by all of industry. So right now, the AV system uses a lot of energy. And so I think some companies feel in order to do longer range and whatnot, they need to be able to rely on an internal combustion engine. As I said, GM does not see a need for this, and at least where we are, is that all AVs should be electric, but there's still definitely, even within the light duty sector, some debate on this. And then some of the vehicles that I see on the road now, they're plug-in hybrids. So we didn't even really get into the different flavors of electric vehicle today, but they have a limited electric range and then use the internal combustion engine. And I suspect that a lot of that, the battery power is going to run in the autonomous system, and a lot of the propulsion is coming from the internal combustion engine.
I think maybe one more question here, and I think this is a really interesting one, which is Michael's around avoiding putting stranded assets in the ground. And I think EV charging can be both an accelerant and an impediment for this larger transition. It's sort of the chicken or the egg. And, we talked a lot about today, sort of the range anxiety. I think David's real anxiety around his smaller battery and showing up with 8 miles. But, how do we think about this concept of efficiency as it relates to network design? Maybe open question for their group in terms of responding to this one.
Well, if I can break the rules and turn that back to you, Andrew, actually, I think Volta is doing really interesting stuff in thinking in better understanding charger utilization, and would love to hear what you think about how that the networks develop.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We talked a lot about sort of battery sizes, and I'm actually maybe to the counter opinion of that, which I actually don't think we need really big batteries. I think there's this range anxiety that is much more of a social psychology or a fear that people have. It's not a reality. So I think
automaker caused, actually, I think.
Yeah.
But
so I think we need to, I think someone talked about it. We need to educate and retrain. And I don't think that we build toward the antiquated model of gas stations, which is building charging infrastructure out of the way. I think we build charging infrastructure into the fabric of lives, and charging actually should fade into the background of what you do. Charging should be where you go, and it should match what you're doing. So when you go to the grocery store, charging is not the fastest solution possible. It actually should match what you're doing within the grocery store. So 40-minute shopping time. If you're at home, it can be slower charging because you're sleeping and charging your car. If you're on a corridor charging network and stopping to get a coffee, then you want faster charging. So I think putting charging in the ground, not at this sort of nameplate capacity of 350 kilowatts to sell cars, which really Tesla and Lucid and some of these other car companies are doing, but to build to the practicality of use and dwell time considerations is probably the best way to think about utilization and efficiency.
And
I guess I would just add that, sorry, go ahead, David.
No, go for it.
Not all underutilized chargers, are sort of wasted, stranded assets. I mean, to really make people comfortable, we've got to, for example, build out a network so that you can do those road trips. You don't do them all the time. You do them sometimes. Those chargers have to be there. And for the foreseeable future, they're not going to have great utilization. But if you step back and look at the network overall, even if they're not used that frequently, they're essential. It's those dots on a map that make people feel comfortable making this choice, even if they don't use them all that often. So I like to think about the whole network overall rather than, hey, this charger is getting a lot of use and that one's not. Because you need both of them. Also agree on getting the right chargers in the right location. I often debate people on, is there even a role for lower power DC fast charging, the 50 or 150, or is it just 350 and above and everything else is a waste? And it depends. What you need in an urban setting where you're, parked for longer is very different than what you want on a road trip off the side of a dark highway where you don't just want to plug in a level 2 and hang out for a day. So getting the right chargers in the right places makes sense. This whole question of stranded assets opens up another discussion you maybe want to have in the future around open standards and whatnot, but I'm not going to go into that now.
Yeah, I mean, Jamie just made an argument for what Rivian's doing with their network, which is putting them in crazy places that people who own Rivians think they want to go.
Yeah.
And so there's like, oh, I'll get a Rivian because I can go to the places I want to go. I mean, gas station owners aren't guaranteed a rate of return, right? Like if someone, wants to build a charging, station, they could lose money on it and that's fine. There's not likely to attract a lot of capital if that's highly likely. So you do see utilities getting to build infrastructure in places that, like Jamie's talking about, that are important for allowing people to adopt, maybe are going to be underutilized, and they're just getting a rate of return on it from all of their ratepayers, but they're not being utilized a lot. They have some value. There's a delicate situation of, are all those chargers literally ones that no private capital would put money into? And then you have in California, you have a very nifty structure where you can install a public fast charger and it can never be used and you will get your rate of return back. So there there are a lot of different things happening to get the infrastructure out there. You know, stranded is only a term that I think people in the utility space think about a lot, right? Stranded just means someone lost money on it, right? So that could just be something that happens to people. There are going to be winners and losers, smarter bet makers and less smart.
And getting the electricity rates right for those low utilization, you know, corridor chargers is important. If you want to improve the business case of those kinds of chargers, we need rates that make more sense for this spiky intermittent use.
I think this should be a future topic for discussion. Open access charging, proper network design, mix between home, public. I think there's a lot to discuss there. Okay, with that, I think let's wrap, because I know there was another portion of the night, which was happy hours, and I don't want to take away from the networking piece of this. But again, thanks to the panelists and thanks to everybody else for dialing in. This was a great conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone so much, and Andrew as well for moderating. That was fantastic. We actually have a poll that's set up for everyone to do that's on this call. And so I'm going to just activate that. So that's sort of a poll figuring out what sort of events you want to have around EVs and otherwise. So everyone should be seeing that. Please go ahead and give us your feedback. We want to make this sort of an EV series here at YPE. So we'd love to have more events that are really tailored to everyone. And if I could get some quick thumbs up, just that the poll is live, that would be really helpful. Fantastic. So before we go into breakouts, wrap up the poll real quick. I also want to make a plug for our newsletter. We send out here at YPE newsletters twice a month, and they talk about great events like this and some of our other programming that I want to highlight, particularly our scholarship that we just launched. It's open for applications through the end of the month. And if one of my YPE teammates could drop our website link into the chat, that would be really helpful. You can see our job board as well as the scholarship, and any students pursuing associates or undergraduate degrees in the Bay Area and have an interest in energy are open to apply. So this is our first year we're doing the scholarship fund, and we're really happy to be supporting that. If you're interested in staying for breakouts, please stay on the call. We're just going to assign everyone randomly, and you can get to know other people that are on the call. If you're not interested, please fill out the poll and then go ahead and drop off so that we don't fill a bunch of breakout rooms with people who maybe aren't able to stay on. So I'll leave the poll open for another maybe 30 seconds, and then we'll send everyone out into breakout rooms. And thank you again to the speakers and to Andrew for moderating. That was fantastic.